Thank you everybody for coming today. Today we have great pleasure to have both Chris and Nicole doing a presentation for the Bedrosian Research Grant Series. The topic is, as you can see, collaboration and culture. And I'm sure you all look forward to listening to both Nicole and Chris to see what they found in the research.
So let me just start with a simple message. This is mostly targeted towards PhD students. Great talks that I used to go to when I was at Berkeley were by Paul David, who was at Stanford. And he wrote some of the early works on early pieces on network economics, and was very famous for that. Every single time that he talked, all he would say, he would start his talk and goes, "All I want you to know is history matters. History matters." And then he would end his talk and goes, "Okay, history matters." So as a nod to him, all I want to say is that the only point you have to remember about this talk is that culture matters. And it matters in the ways that collaborative networks get formed and how they dissolve. Now, the importance of culture into political analysis is not new. Daniel Patrick Moynihan has a great quote here. I don't have quotation marks around it because I reworked it a little bit to fit my needs. Linking politics and culture. And at the same time, Aaron Wildavsky, who ended his career at Berkeley, really focusing in on cultural analysis and its application to all sorts of policy questions and budgeting questions, gave his American Political Science Associate address almost 20 years ago on that matter. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be talking about the dynamics of collaborative networks. How do they form and when do they dissolve? And we're really going to be focusing on the devolution part, but it's really that's just a small piece in a much larger set of questions. So, and what we're going to be trying to do is just move beyond structural and resource dependence explanations for how they arise and when they fall apart. And that's really been the focus of the literature to this point. And to me, the argument would be this is kind of strange, because if you think about it, some of the things that, what are the major forms of social control? We have markets, free exchange, we have hierarchies where people just apply rules through authority, and then we have moral suasion. And it's really, moral suasion is very closely connected to both culture, and it's very closely connected towards network governance, because networks are characterized by relationships that don't rely wholly on either market-based transactions or authority. So we're going to link culture to structure as that it's just going to be a guide to action. It's going to create some biases on who you want to interact with that, and that is going to help us explain how some networks that we observe form and dissolve. So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to do a little bit of tag team in this talk, and Nicole will give about half of it. She's going to talk and set up the network emergence and collaboration. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can bring in some very simple cultural theory into this application. Nicole will present our case study, which is an analysis of the affordable housing network in Los Angeles that we've done. And then we're going to, and I will end by presenting some information on how culture really is an important variable for understanding how these networks have evolved.
So here we're moving on to the structural explanations of network emergence and maintenance. So some of the major literature on structure and contextual factors that start networks are these macro forces in collaborative governance. So top-down pressures to collaborate. So governments asking nonprofits to provide services and things like that. The other one in many of the policy-type network literature you'll see are the opening of collaborative windows. So we have this macro force of what's going on in the environment. Affordable housing becomes a major issue, or climate change becomes a major policy issue. And so we have organizations deciding to join and get together in some sort of collective policy action. Also in the network literature, we have kind of micro forces. These are organizational or individual level forces which encourage them to participate in collaboration. So one of them would be resource needs. And these both resource needs and collective action solving, and all of these are all very much done in the literature of, organizations collaborate because they need something from another person, another organization. So it solves their financial resource needs, it solves many different types of collection action problems where we need multiple organizations in order to solve something. And so what we're really interested in is bringing more cultural types of information into why organizations would partner with who they would partner with and dissolve these partnerships that are outside of these types of factors. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the most famous cases of networks, small group network action, and it's the case of Zacharys Karate Club. And what happened in this, he did an ethnography of a university karate club, so little kids would go to this university-based class and learn how to do karate. And through his observations, he found that eventually there was a dilemma where some parents wanted to pay the karate teacher more money and other people didn't want to increase his pay. And so when they didn't increase his pay, the karate instructor left and went to another place, and he brought with him some of the families followed him. So some of the questions, the very first questions of all kind of social network analysis comes from this case in 1977. And this is such an infamous case that even you could buy a onesie with it. And what this says under here is, if your methods can't fit this network, then go home, right? Because you find these algorithms. So what he tried to model is why do we see fissures in small groups? Could we predict a split in this karate club? And what he does is he uses a cut flow model, and his algorithm is what's still used. And what he said is that sometimes there's a bottleneck, and if we can find the points where there's this bottleneck and we sever this thing away, it will break up the network. And if we can identify weak points in the network, that's how we can explain fissure. So what does this have to do with anything? So this moves on to, later on, Goodwin. They create what they call community detection, and within networks what they look for is high clustering within groups within the network, and then kind of links between the different types of clusters. And the reason why this is really important is because all collaboration networks kind of follow this pattern of having high levels of clustering in groups, and small groups, because they're based on who do you do something with. So you're going to have this is an academic collaboration of co-authorship. So you're going to have high clustering within groups, and then small links, high clustering and small links between the different groups. And what Goodwin say is that this makes any type of collaborative arrangements over a large field very vulnerable to breaking apart. And so rather than just focusing on these small things, we should look at the whole field to see where can we see it break. And this is from Newman's recent article in 2012 in Nature Physics. And as you can see, I'm putting this right here, it was received September 23rd and accepted November 4th. Also in this thing was that what we have in this system is people who are very highly productive, highly central. They'll be connected to all the highly productive central people, but once we take out, the great thing, once we take out this person, does someone take their place, or does science then die? But
So is it something bad? Why would that be sort of bad? I mean, what is good about this kind of feature?
I can get to that, but since Chris will allow me to take questions.
The idea in what many sociologists would argue is that it's actually at the boundaries of these areas where you have the most productive work. So Uzi who did the networks of Broadway productions, and what he showed is that it was new productions that created new mixtures of talent and producers that tended to be the most successful ones, and that's exactly
exactly what these types of co-authorship networks are showing.
When I talk about our network, I'll talk about it differently, but particularly in like science and things like this, it depends how fast you want knowledge. Some networks are good for knowledge production, like this is going to diffuse quickly, and some need like tacit knowledge learning, where these people are not connected to any of that, they're only connected to this person. So he talks a lot about learning patterns and things like that. So Chris, go ahead.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about culture. And I'll start with caveats from a public administration perspective. Is that this is always a dangerous thing to start. And a great example of this is Aaron Wildavsky started this, and he attracted many scholars, and there was a number of people who graduated from Berkeley in the mid-1980s who went on and did cultural analysis and political science. And I think all of them have moved their research elsewhere since then because it's just a very difficult topic. And one of the real difficulties is that we don't have a single conceptualization of it, and so people are using this term culture in many different ways. I kind of played with the idea of putting up a joke with my tongue in my cheek, just saying culture is basically the pornography of a political science. It's that you know it, you know it when you see it, but it's really hard to describe what it is. So let me come up with some terms from this. So working with Paul and Nina's work, culture is really, it's a pattern of interaction. And so it's something consistent in the way that interactions, that people share some assumptions, some worldviews that consistently pattern their ways, and that has very much to do with their participation in a particular group. Similarly, Mary Douglas, who worked with Aaron Wildavsky, she really linked culture very much with institutions. Is that the idea that she really pushed on was that we embed ourselves in particular forms of institutions that have particular structures, and those structures create biases and constraints that eventually generate a certain worldview, a way of thinking that patterns your behavior in a way that you could term as a culture. An important thing about culture and the way that we approach this work is cultures are tacit. You can't go up and ask someone, what's your culture? Because they usually are acting it out, but can't describe it to you. And that's why, at least in this project, it's very important to use ethnographic terms, because you need to do that type of deep field work to really be able to detect these cultures. One thing that I think many people talk about cultures, and a lot of public administration work, when people talk about culture, all that they seem to be talking is like everyone in an organization is getting along better. So there's monolithic culture. And once you have that culture, the organization can be more productive. But what they don't answer that question is, are there different types of cultures that they could all agree on? And the important point that we're making here, and I'll just be showing you a model, is that there really are different prototypical cultures that you can really think about and apply to different circumstances. And the final thing is, lots of people talk about culture as a national base, that there are differences. Now, there are different national cultures, but I think that actually a lot of the interesting things that go on in both countries and within organizations are the clashes between different cultural types. So what we're going to be doing is that we're just going to apply a fairly simple typology that was developed by Mary Douglas and then used by Aaron Wildavsky, called group grid analysis. And the idea behind group grid analysis is that most people are faced with two critical problems in their life that really determine a lot of their action. Who am I and what should I do? When Aaron wrote about this, the really thing that he wrote about this is like it was in contradiction to the economic model, where you take preferences as exogenous and then we don't have to ask anything. It says, well, no, actually preferences are endogenous and they should be an important field of study. And as you will know, that there's many different ways to answer these two different questions, and then they have very big impacts. So for the who I am question, you really look at the group. So you have you can think of yourself either as part of a particular group and very strongly identified with that group, or you can identify with either other groups or not with any particular group. So we just have this dimension about how strongly you define themselves as a member of a particular group. And then grid is just defined as what's the degree to which actions of group members are prescribed by the group in which that they're a member. So are there particular roles in a hierarchy or an organization? Are there particular rules of behavior that are all forms of prescriptions? And so that they argue that these are two important dimensions for determining cultures, and then you can just put them into a typology. And based on that, they just have typically talked about 4 prototypical types of cultures. There are hierarchies that have a high sense of group and a high sense of prescription. A military organization is a clear form of hierarchy. Most government bureaucracies would also be determine that. Some of the things that they have argued that come out of that is that you tend to value order, because that your position within your group is accepted, that they also accept the wide use of expertise. And so if you have types of uncertainty, you end up dealing with experts for those things. The problems that they see is deviance. It's that we are part of a group, we are well ordered as a group, and it's deviance from that order as the major problem that we want to look at. The other type of cultural characteristic that most people can identify with are individualists, so that have both low level of prescriptions. They don't feel like many rules apply to them based on their role, and they don't necessarily feel very tied to any particular organization. This I actually would argue is we get acculturated in academia, and academia is full of many, many individualists. So we tend to value individual liberty. The way that you deal with uncertainty is that you make transactions. You're a free rider. Nothing is tying you down so that you can make agreements with other people. But the main risk that you face is the impediments to making those types of trades. And in the framing of problems, we think that individual failure is the source of most problems. You also have fatalists, which come up here, that you have a high level of prescription. So there's a lot of rules that apply and control your behavior, but you're not really a member of a group. Frequently, sometimes this has been dismissed as a null set and not a really active culture. But the one examples that I've seen that seem to make sense is Sicilian culture, living in a city where you're controlled by mafia forces, so that there's a lot of prescription in what can be done, but there's a high degree of anomie that you're not really a member of a large group. And so there, that the risk is pervasive, and what you just have to do is accept it. Now, these different ones will also lead to different collaborative preferences. And individuals, as the way I described it, are natural collaborators, that they want to be able to make trades and deals with other people, and that they're also able to bridge between different cultural styles, because they're always trying to set a deal. Fatalists, and another thing, you would not expect them to be to collaborate at all because of their fatalism. And both hierarchists and egalitarians can collaborate, but they have different preferences for it. Because of hierarchists' preferences for order, they'll be willing to have a collaboration, but they would like to have that collaboration ruled by particular roles and particular levels of authority. In contrast, egalitarians may be willing to collaborate, but that they would want a more collaborative, equal style, since they want to have low levels of prescription. So that's not a great differentiation between actors. They would like all actors in a collaboration to have equal ability to participate in the governance. And so that makes these two guys, hierarchists and egalitarians, more likely just to collaborate with each other, because they understand each other's culture and style of working with things. Okay, so now we're going to be going to our empirical example.
So our empirical example is the Los Angeles affordable housing field. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we came up with this. So we have collaborative methods here. So here's a photo of the major kind of coalition march for affordable housing. This is circa 2001. And so our group, what we're looking at is we're looking at all organizations. They were that They took a survey in 2009. Any organization that kind of identified, we wanted to pick people who identified as housing being a policy issue. And Chris did the survey, so it was kind of a name generating procedure, and they allowed the field to grow and people to identify rather than a prescribed survey where the survey people made the frame and then surveyed them. So it was an evolving type of frame. So you surveyed 145 organizations and then came up with a network field of 229 organizations. There was a response rate about 58%. And on top of that, there is an ethnography of 9 organizations that were part of this major coalition that had about, there was 18 members of the steering committee, and each member is from a different type of, a different organization, and they make a major coalition. 18 organizations were on the steering committee, and there was an ethnography of 9 of the organizations that were done by Paul Lichterman. And how long did you do the ethnography? It's still going, right?
Yes, it is still going. You could say 2.5 years.
2.5 years, a long time. So the combination of methods allows us to take these organizations that were in the steering committee that were actually pushing it along, steering the coalition, I guess you would say, and we can take the ethnography and we can place it within the larger field of this whole policy network. And we could see them within the field, and since we have the ethnographic data, we can follow the evolution of the steering committee. So here's our network of 229 organizations, and the question that this is representing is, who do you collaborate with? That's not exactly the wording, but close enough. And you can see that we have about 27 public organizations, 64 advocacy civic organizations, 44 service providers, we have neighborhood councils, housing development, nonprofit business associations, and then 24 for-profit organizations. When you see it sized by degree, meaning who is mentioned most and who does the most collaborating, let's say. The pink organizations are our civic advocacy groups, so you can see they do a lot of the collaboration. And then you also see that the government organizations do a lot of people mention them, and they're kind of very central to the network.
Nicole, we have a question.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
The boxes relative, for instance, the black ones are on the bottom. Does it matter that they're on the bottom rather than the top?
No. It matters just the size. Part of it was open. So do you collaborate with anyone, such as providing information, providing resources, exchanging information, exchanging resources? So these are all formal, joint types of collaborations. Yeah. So joint projects, anything like that. So these are not just who do you talk with or stuff like that. So our network has a pretty low density of 0.002, if that means anything to you. The steering committee, of course, is very central to the network, as we can imagine. Their centrality is 6.38, which is like twice as much as the mean for anybody else in the network. So they're very central to this whole field. But what we're trying to really talk about and figure out is this empirical puzzle. This is our question, really. Here is the steering committee prior to 2002, where we don't have their network stuff. Here they are during the field study in 2008. Here are their connections. These groups leave the steering committee. And then here is at the end of the field study where we have 2 separate coalitions. So these organizations decide to leave the major steering committee and form their own coalition.
And let me just add one little important detail, is that this was, and Paul, jump in, is that this was a fairly heated fissure. So they had a meeting to reinvigorate this movement to promote affordable housing policies. And at that meeting, 3 of these organizations got up and loudly denounced the entire movement. Even though this was the movement that they had been working with previously, and then they broke off and then they created a new housing coalition, bringing some of the steering committee with them.
Are you going to tell us what those dots reflect in terms of the groups you showed us earlier, civic and so forth, business?
Oh, actually, we won't these are actually all civic organizations, except for two, which are nonprofit housing organizations.
Everything we're looking at is civic?
Yes.
So you've dropped out the business and all those others? Okay, I didn't know.
We
that.
didn't, they were chosen by the steering
That's
committee.
okay, I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah. Yes, the members of the steering committee for the coalition, they were all civic, and they did not choose. I guess,
Tim.
government.
Was there a precursor or a trigger that precipitated the denunciation?
Probably a whole book you could read on that.
There was a series of arguments, and Chris and Nicole are referring to a particularly heated meeting. The tensions had been brewing for some time, so.
But I'm wondering, for example, was there either an actual or perceived decline in terms of the perception that the coalition had of its effectiveness? Or was there a decline, a perception of a decline in resources that were coming to?
How did people get on the steering committee?
Yeah, because they're the ones that decided who then was going to join the coalition process, which is why like some business organizations weren't chosen, right?
Yeah, now a couple of answers to the first is that these are people who are actively involved in going to steering committee meetings. The number of endorsers of the coalition was much larger, so not all endorsers were members of the steering committee. The steering committee was a subset of people who endorsed, at least on paper, the campaign. And that was the committee was rotating. New organizations would be asked on every year or so, as far as I know. And I saw some of the rotation in the time that I was doing the ethnographic research, so that was intentional to get some showing from the different parts of the affordable housing field.
But then by the end, not all of those different colored box organizations that we saw on the slide previously were still participating.
Some had dropped out. Some had dropped out of the steering committee. That's part of the interesting puzzle.
Yeah, but they dropped out not because their turn was over, but because they left. Yeah. So our thing is to explain this fissure. And like we were saying is that, so the Zacharys Karate Club example is going to use cut points and use actually structural arguments to say why a fissure would occur. Another side of the argument would be what the said in the back, I'm sorry, I don't hear you. But this whole thing where an event occurs and, you know, collaborative windows now close, and or affordable housing is solved, we all go home. But that wasn't really what happened. And so we're going to talk about how the cultural types is what breaks this apart. So here we go. Oh, there you go. Which best explains why this fissure occurs: structure, closing of collaborative windows, or organizational culture? And so, of course, we're going to argue that organizational culture plays the largest role in the evolution of these networks. So here we have our Goodwin-Newman partitioning. So what this does is it breaks out, it does clustering, and you get within a partition if, depending on how weighted ties within your group are versus ties to the outside. So we have within group and across group ties, and the algorithm puts them into different groups. So I highlighted some of the different groups, and this so this one is very heavily government, business and government. This one up here, homeless services and housing advocates, affordable housing providers, housing advocates, and all the blue ones are, the other ones that are not labeled, are very much the social service providers. So now we have our partitions, and we would predict from Goodwin-Newman and Zachary that it would break between these partitions. and that the steering committee would be probably clustered in like one of the partitions. So these larger colored nodes are members of the steering committee in our sample, and they actually go across different groups. So if you look at this organization right here, you can see that this organization has a lot of ties within their group and ties outside of the partition. And this this is bridging. So I highlighted, we have 7 of the 18 organizations that actually bridge major parts of this whole field. Now, this is actually what could actually cause a fissure in the steering committee, because they're all parts of different groups, is actually something that could be good for the entire field. So for instance, this organization, we don't know, but they could actively try and select major organizations that actually cluster in other areas to be part of the steering committee to pull them into the coalition. So in the different policy network literature, they look at these different bridging types of organizations and think that they're good because they could moderate, they could be the more moderate person that keeps everybody together. Yes?
Sorry, that one at the very top seems to be so isolated. Why would that be a bridge?
Which,
The one in the middle, the highest one?
yeah, that's a member of a steering committee?
No,
Center.
in the middle, the one. Yeah, that one. Yeah, visually, it's so lonely. Why could that be a bridge?
It means that it bridges between between that partition and, say, one of these other partitions.
How did you identify with it?
Through social network analysis, they do.
I mean, was there part of our program you studied to identify bridges, or did you count time? I mean, what's the actual decision? What's a decision rule?
Number that shows it is a bridge.
Yes. There's numbers, so each of these are within group ties and without group ties, and it's an organization that has also outgoing ties to another partition.
So does this show that there's potentially a risk that these two in the corner might break off because they have less ties?
Yes. So there's a risk that both people who bridge actually might break, one side of the bridge or the other bridge may break, right? And we find that that doesn't happen. Do you have more questions, Peter? Okay. So here are actually these organizations that are members of the steering committee that are circled in red are the ones that leave the group. So it goes against many of the different things that we would imagine that, the break would be either right here, so all these people would go, or the breaks would be like between the people that bridge, which don't. Yes, go ahead, Peter.
The organizations in those boxes don't think of themselves as a group, or do they?
Not necessarily, no. We didn't know so for instance, Paul did all the cultural analysis and the cultural coding before, completely separately from this part of the analysis. So it's not like we can decide, we're going to put everyone here and they're all going to be the same culture, how convenient for all of us, or we're going to spread them out, how convenient. Right?
And that's why I haven't figured out that the boxes represent different cultures or something.
No.
Okay.
They represent different clusters. So you'll see that most of these are housing activist organizations. And how we know what their identity of, what we call their kind of like service or organization is that in the survey they were asked what do they do. Also we had their mission statements. We looked at their tax IDs if they were nonprofits and used all this to make sure that they were categorized appropriately, but that was also done separate from the network analysis. So they're not getting their identity from the analysis. Okay? So here are the groups that leave. So why do they leave? Now Chris has the great pleasure of telling you why they leave.
as we were saying, as we were doing the social network analysis, we were also doing ethnography of these organizations. And what Paul really found, and he categorized them in using slightly different terminology than what we presented here, but one set of groups was using an organizational culture, exhibiting an organizational culture that he called community of interest. And so they had very fluid boundaries and could work with many different people and were extremely strategic in their thinking. And then he contrasted that to another set of organizations that he found in his ethnographies that he characterized as indigenized communities, where they had much more tightly drawn boundaries, and that their bonds were fitted over, attached to a particular place, and they really valued authenticity. And so everyone would be able to speak as a member of this organization. And so just fitting this into this typology, this really fits very much as an individualistic organization with low grid and low group. And then these really fit the egalitarian, where there's a low level of prescription rules enforced on these, or a high level of rules, but a low sense of group. No, I'm sorry, a high sense of group and a low sense of status differentiation. So, and just to give you a couple examples of these about the way that they talk. And so the one thing I learned about ethnography is that, in talking with Paul, is that you really listen much more carefully to what people talk about as an ethnographer than I do as a policy analyst. And it's not only what they talk about, it's what they get upset about when other people talk that really makes quite a difference. And here, this was the individualistic organization had a rally. So we had two different opposing rallies, and they both were speaking to these large audiences. And so the individualistic organization uses this very strategic, spanning type of mode. We're here to say that as a city we can do better. So we're all in it together. And we can call upon the mayor and city council to adopt the 3-point plan that Housing Justice has put forward, so that they're all about let's make a deal. Very individual, very rational, not a tight boundary between themselves and the city. And let's contrast this to a rally put on by the egalitarian organization. First of all, that's an important thing, is that one of the speakers of this is just one of the residents. And what real indication of that everyone has equal status here. So everyone can speak. We don't have to have a bunch of housing experts, but everyone has authority in this debate. So they put on a resident because that development's putting me at risk of being displaced. I placed my life on the line for this country, and so I deserve a place to live. And then you can see the differences between their relationship between their group and the city, where this group is saying, we don't want to have an ordinance. Why don't we have an ordinance? Bureaucracy, city bullshit, bureaucracy is holding it up. Today's just the beginning. We'll be back next week. We'll be here every day until they serve us. This is not at all about making a deal with the city. This is about drawing lines, about the city having to do something about a community, and in particular a community that's under attack. So here is what we get when we look at this. We were able to code. Is it 9? 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 11 organizations for which we have been able to determine the code in this. And when you look at this breakout, all of a sudden culture just jumps out at you as a potential explanation. Every one of the member of the Breakaway Coalition whose culture we've identified is an egalitarian organization. This one member who did not leave the steering committee was nonetheless one of the groups that severely denounced the steering committee in that very contentious meeting. But why they didn't go and join this new housing coalition, that's the error term in our analysis. So so culture is unlike structure in that Zacharys karate club, where structure clearly delineated the two halves of the fissure. Here we don't. Structure doesn't work, because one of the things that you see is actually when you look at the amount of collaboration between these groups, there's a fair amount of intergroup collaboration prior to this breakup. So it doesn't look like structure is working very well. The blue ones that left are the egalitarians. The red ones that stayed in the coalition were identified as individualistic.
So the number 9, what is
Right. So this is the one, an egalitarian organization that nonetheless stayed on the steering committee. John?
So I wonder, how can you distinguish between, I assume culture is more enduring, right? It's sort of embedded. How do you distinguish culture from posturing? Maybe I'm working for the school. If I deal with one issue, I adopt a certain strategy, a certain posture. When I deal with another issue, I might have another posture. So how do you distinguish them?
Paul gets to answer.
Yeah, a couple of things. This could be a longer, it's a great talk. It could be longer, and if it were an hour or so longer, then we'd go into some of the ins and outs of cultural analysis. One being that, yeah, I agree completely. When we're talking about the culture of the organizations here, we mean the culture that's evident in the setting under study. Because that's what's going to matter most, is what are the assumptions, what are the lived understandings in the setting under study. So here, that's what we're talking about, and it's possible that some of these organizations have a different culture, you might say, in some other setting. That's not going to matter for the interaction in this setting that I studied ethnographically. So, but we're glad you asked the question because it enables us to lengthen the talk by a couple of minutes. But that's part of doing a cultural analysis ethnographically is to take the setting seriously and say what are the assumptions, what's the picture of the world that's operating here? Because you're absolutely right, when they're somewhere else they may be operating on somewhat different assumptions. It's an empirical question.
I'm getting curious, methodologically, I mean, it seems to me that the cultural characteristics you've identified, the individualistic and the egalitarian, is a spectrum.
Oh, yeah.
And if it's a spectrum, maybe 9 is somewhere toward the egalitarian, but I mean, I don't know, but does your data shed any light on the possibility? You're just talking about, it's at the margins here and which way they swing.
It's hard because then it's like what we said, it's then restating based on what we see here as.
Maybe some fussy.
Right, yeah. Methodologically, we would really like to fix the cultures without making reference to network position.
That's all right. To rate them off the culture, if you had a scale of 1 to 10,
That's right. So that's
and they're a 6, which is
Okay.
Yes. So what we presented were typologies that were, ideal types typologies.
dichotomous here.
But we do have suggestions in the conclusion that we're working on of survey questions that if you wanted to ask survey questions to gauge that Likert scale of.
Yeah. So it's not an error term, it's just there further on.
I don't know. And I think
They don't know that
The error term in our measurement.
So there are people that study culture that would suggest that it's not a continuous, that there's not a continuum of culture, that culture is in some ways kind of you can't be, a 6 out of 10 on a culture.
Maybe you can't and I can't, but how about an organization collectively could be?
Right. I mean, I think it gets down to the question of how, whether you think culture is something that can be measured based on various dimensions and then come up with a score.
Maybe it's a probabilistic statement.
So our argument basically is that when you look at culture, you can really identify this fissure very nicely. So now let's look at the alternatives to see whether we can come up with another way to describe this fissure. So the first one would be that there was a cut point, that somehow that there wasn't a lot of collaboration going on between the groups that break away and they don't. And I think that if you just look at this graph, that suggests so. We've run a bunch of network statistics, and that all supports exactly the same conclusion, that there's not a strong division between this part of the network and the other part of the network based on patterns of collaboration. So that's the strong argument of structure determining fissures isn't working for us here. There's another one. The one thing that I will say is that while the cut points don't explain the fissure, just as an aside, an important thing is that culture does help explain the boundary spanning. As you were asking earlier, exactly who put all this together and why were we getting this boundary? The peak organization that was helping put this network together was identified as an individualistic organization. That would suggest an organization that has a broad perspective on what the field looks like and wants and can work with a large range of different organizations. And so in some ways, understanding what the culture of that organization helps explain why the steering committee spans so many different facets of this housing field. Now, another thing that you could think about is that maybe there was just organizational drift and that they were just focused in on slightly different things. Some people may be focusing on rent control. Other people may be focusing in on SRO preservation. I actually had a slide where I put their mission statements side by side, but we don't want that floating out there because anyone could Google the mission statements and find the organizations, and we're making some effort at least to keep them anonymous. Though if someone really wanted to figure this out, they could probably come up with good guesses of who they are. And if you look at the mission statements of both the breakaway organization and the original one, what really is striking is how similar they are. They're both talking about the preservation of low-income housing, that they both talk about the creation of affordable housing. The only little area of difference is that the breakaway organization has more of a focus on public housing versus the other one has more of a focus on changes in zoning laws that promote construction of new housing. So that's one slight difference. But then they both have a really strong emphasis on rent control, the enforcement of rent control laws, and preventing landlords from evicting tenants to raise the rent or to sell those properties. So we're just arguing that really, if you look at those two mission statements, your reaction should be, oh, these people should be working together because they want the same thing. Now, another option that you can always think about is that maybe we just have a prisoner's dilemma situation here. So in any typical prisoner's dilemma, which is characterized as most collaboration, is that people probably would like to join a collaboration rather than sitting out because they can both work together, and then it increases the probability that they will achieve some public good. The problem, though, is, and what creates this prisoner dilemma, is that it really takes some effort to be a member of the coalition, and so sometimes you want a free ride, and if you sit out, this organizational one actually does a better job because they can still receive the benefits if the other guy succeeds, but they didn't have to put the effort into it. And so this is the classic problem. So if we think of collaboration as a prisoner's dilemma, we should be seeing collaborations fall apart all the time just because of the basic incentives here. But the interesting thing that we have is that we have a prisoner's dilemma where one of the organizations in here had another strategy, and they exercised that strategy. They just didn't sit out quietly, but they loudly denounced them. And so this is very similar to the setup that I had before. You have some public benefit, so that if you can get affordable housing, they will benefit from it. And there's some probability that you would get it if you put effort into into a political movement. What happens if you both work together is that you increase the probability, and there may be some economies of scale in here where working together you actually do better, but then you have to put in some effort to be part of the collaboration C. And so depending on having C equal be in between two things, you get a classic prisoner's dilemma where someone would prefer to sit out rather than to join, but they would both prefer to join rather than to sit out together. So then the question becomes, well, if we have this standard prisoner's dilemma, would you ever see someone denounce? So all that I did here for the denouncing is that if you denounce, there's some impact to denouncing them. So you're going to decrease the probability of success by some amount. So this script D is just some number between 0 and 1, and that just indicates that you're hurting the other guys by denouncing them. And then it actually takes some effort to denounce them, to go to the meeting, to organize people to denounce them. What you notice that just in this very simple setup, PB is always greater than this term right here. So you would never expect why denounce someone because what you want to do is just free ride. If you care about the same things, in my previous slide I showed that they did care about the same things. If you didn't like what they were doing, then you just free ride. You walk away quietly and you don't do anything. What's this whole idea about you going to a meeting and denouncing and talking trash, essentially? And the one thing that you can do that's kind of interesting is you can save this whole thing by just adding one little term that's a term for cultural compromise. And so you can think about this is that you can work with another organization that doesn't share your culture, doesn't share your worldview or your policy frame. And there's some cost to that. But even though there's some cost to that, there's still maybe some circumstances where you prefer to have collaboration rather than everyone sitting out. So you can have a social. The preferred solution is a social movement versus that, but you still have the incentives to free ride. What you can get in this instance, though, is that if you compromise culturally to join a coalition, well, what happens when you denounce the coalition? You denounce the coalition, you get to reaffirm we are different from you because we are denouncing you. So you take that exact same term as that this is how much it costs me to denounce. Now all of a sudden I'm going to gain that back by denouncing. So this is all that the cultural difference is that if you have to compromise culturally, you can benefit from denouncing it, and then you can come up with an instance where if culture is that matter and you're able to state your identity to yourselves, to your stakeholders, and to your members by denouncing, then this can become a preferred strategy over just free riding. Yes.
I like this logic. I was just wondering if what really happened was sort of a denounce and join at the same time.
Right. Actually, if we really wanted to get, notice I only have 2 players here, and so I don't have an end-player equilibrium. But you could do that, and then actually I think the logic wouldn't necessarily change, because what you would be doing is that there was some negative W from having to compromise culturally within a steering committee where there were different organizations. And what we see is that there's a very homogeneous break-off group where then this little W would either be 0 or it actually may be positive, because you're working with others, reaffirming your worldview.
What if the choice to denounce has sort of a more utilitarian function where you're trying to get others to defect and join your new movement?
That's actually
right. Whether you're envisioning your organization as being the next sort of Martin Luther, and creating a new schism and pulling, basically getting others to sit out or denounce, but even sit out is fine, and then creating a new game.
Okay. If that was it, that you want to create a new movement, then that raises the question, why leave the existing movement? Because if the benefits are from having more members, and that's kind of your argument, you already have a lot of members in this, and these are very fragile equilibriums. So why upset this very fragile equilibrium unless that new group is going to have something very different to it?
But if you identify other members in the original coalition that you maybe sort of intuitively understand have your same sort of W value, right, then maybe giving voice to the issue that you have with the current structure might cause them to come around to your
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but I think that the logic that you're still doing is that there's this, culture has, the nice feature of this is that culture is a cost in one coalition and it's a benefit in another coalition. So it's a cost when you have to work with people that you don't share your worldview with, and it's a benefit when you can reaffirm your worldview by working with people. That's essentially what you're saying, is that cost became too much, and you can try to break away and form another coalition. Yes.
The thing I noticed was that the people who broke away and who denounced are still connected to the other group.
Remember, actually, that's not completely true, because this is just an anomaly of our data. that we only did one social network survey. And so the time span is we started around 2008. And so we constructed this from just knowledge of asking who was on the steering committee in the past. We started doing ethnography, and we did a social network analysis between 2008 and early 2009. And essentially this fissure happened as we were wrapping up the social network analysis. But we only have one social network analysis. So the real question would be that whether if you had the resources to do another one, and we do not. We are not to do not get into your head to say, oh, you should do another survey. That it would be really interesting to see whether then the collaborations started forming only within the organizations.
He's bringing up a good point that those ties are still those ties. We've just rearranged them.
So the denouncing and so forth, that it seems like that then resulted in two organizations with two different steering committees, and perhaps there's some positive outcome there in terms of you still have the same people and they're still talking to each other, but now they each have their own separate agenda setting process.
That's a very interesting question, is how much collaboration there has been between these two different housing movements. I can tell you that this housing steering committee and movement still exists de facto, but is essentially defunct, or in hibernation at least, until they think that there's another policy window, because they have not been able to get their agenda acted on by the city council, this one also actually, from when I'm looking at their website, it's not clear to me. Their website has not been updated in a year. Let me just say. So that would, based on that evidence, I think this was the fissure was not a great positive for affordable housing advocacy. But we have to put this in a larger context. That they've been trying this for a long time, and that they had been failing and failing. So after a while, they just decided to put their energies elsewhere.
You raised a point here, which is part of the follow-on of this. I'm looking at the timeline too, 2008, 2009. We're in the middle of the recession. So there may be very little hope for more resources going into public housing. And I'm curious, it's a kind of a counterfactual, but could it be that having two separate organizations could be more effective in lobbying for the actual policy they want to accomplish than having one, which you don't, you have to do a comparative. If you have a place where the coalition didn't break up and they were successful, or the same outcome, which could be having nothing to do with the networking, coalition and fissure, but external economic situations that cast a pall over all public investment in low-income housing. How does this relate to the policy they started to champion?
The network effects of how structure, resources, dynamics of networks affects their actual outcomes is a huge research question, and we've been really having to struggle hard to be how clear that we're not able to answer that question with these data, and so we've been focusing in just on the network dynamics questions. Now, having said that, all I can say now that I read about networks, housing-based networks in other cities, they have they have had greater success. I think LA is a city where this is this type of civil society is stunted, and we have felt that from a policy perspective also. The other piece of evidence that's not particularly on housing, but is just Ellen Chao's dissertation, and that is really, she has shown in comparing urban renewal projects from Los Angeles, from cities all over the United States and all over the world, LA is this incredible outlier for a fractured policymaking process that other places have much more centralized, much more cohesive networks of organizations running urban policy and neighborhood renewal, which there's a good amount of overlap between those two policy areas. And so I don't think we have enough evidence, but my gut feeling is that this is not a good sign for policy making in Los Angeles.
Just a little bit further, which is it because Los Angeles has a lot of egalitarian organizations and the other cities have far more individualistic cultures?
Is it because of the geography of Los Angeles?
Well, we chose organizations particularly in central city area, particularly for that reason. So, but your question about what types of organization, what type of culture, and is that culture the same in if I could say it, the distribution of culture across cities is the same. Yeah. It's a good question, and I've actually thought about this as like, do we just have more civic organizations in Los Angeles versus government organizations in this network? And I think that with the fissure between the steering committee, like we were saying, it doesn't necessarily affect the whole network because they're still within that whole network. It depends where the breaks are, and if the breaks are that kind of the bridging thing with David is if we look at where these bridges are and where the breaks are, if they are between, they were linking up advocates with the government and there's your break, that's probably not going to be good if you have a broker per se. So.
I wonder what is the utility of making it more complex than may be needed, since it might be a group of organizations just suddenly wake up and realize that you have to change your posture in order to get what you want. That might be the explanation, that they broke up.
So you're saying they changed their culture?
No, I mean, that's why I was saying the culture versus posturing. I mean, they wake up that they realize unless you really take a more militant strategy, you won't get what you want. They just woke up. Is that more straightforward?
Because I've been wondering, how is this culture or is it just different strategies?
Yeah.
Do they have to be mutually exclusive?
Okay,
I think we can answer this. I think that there's a strong amount of evidence to indicate that these are different cultures, and so that the ways that they're perceived, the way that city outsiders are affecting them, and how they interrelate to outsiders, and how they interrelate to each other within their groups, that are all culturally bound. On the strategy side, what's surprising is how similar these strategies are. You look at their mission statements, they're very similar. Do they both use public rallies? They both use public rallies. Do they both use the technique of packing city council to get support for their events? They both use that technique. It's not.
I think strategy at the organizational level, not at the coalition level. That different organizations with different preferences about how to approach their shared goal, and the fissure is a function of differences in means.
Can I speak to that quickly? The differences in preferences from a sociological point of view, where I come from somewhere, and so in part we're saying to the extent that there are differences in strategy at the organizational level, those aren't random, and it would be hard to make a kind of simple rational choice argument. They're probably having something to do with culture. That's where the preferences come from. That'd be the argument.
I guess sorry. All time to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think when you look at strategies, the strategies are remarkably similar. What differs is the way that they frame problems, and then and how they frame correct courses, what's appropriate course of action, and a lot of it actually comes down to use of language. So it's not so much. So let me wind this down. I will. These are a bunch of the academic conclusions from this. They can all be skipped. If people want me to come back to it. And this really goes back to what do you get out of this? And I think one of the things is that a large portion of the literature on collaboration, because it's written by academics, and it's because people who are very strongly influenced by individualists, just kind of think in this strategic frame. And I think that there needs to be much greater sensitivity that organizations with a collaboration all have their different organizational logics. And so just because you're going to agree strategically on certain goals, certain courses of actions, that doesn't necessarily mean that the organizational logics are concordant, and that can create tensions. And I think that's really what we were seeing in this case right here. And having blind spot to this can be a real constraint. I think that from talking to Paul about this, there's a real argument that one of the central organizers was an individualist organization. They could not see the way that they were rubbing the egalitarian organizations the wrong way, because they just didn't conceive of it. They were being strategic, and they thought, look, we all agree on what the goals are, let's work together. And they didn't understand that their wording, the way that they talked about strategy was creating real difficulties for these other organizations. So having those types of blind spots can be a real danger. In the organizational culture literature, there's this term that they like to throw around of cultural toolkits. And the idea with a cultural toolkit is, yes, there are multiple cultures within your organization and between organizations, and part of that toolkit is not only being able to recognize them, but being able to bridge between them. And Mische, who writes about the cultural and political movements, talks about switching logics, where you have to be able to go to one meeting and talk like one person, and then go to another meeting and talk to someone else. And so that we would argue that there's real value in people who want to develop and maintain collaborations to be able to think about this. And we're saying it's like we're not suggesting that you go out and do ethnographies of all the organizations that you do. We would all drop dead from fatigue. But you can just begin by asking a couple of very simple questions and thinking through what is the organizational logic between this. So what's the degree of status differences maintained within an organization? If it's high, it's much more likely to be hierarchical. And how tightly connected are organizational members to each other in relation to the outside world? How important is grid? How important is group? Can begin to allow you to think how these cultures operate. And then the group grid analysis gives you some very quick hypotheses about some possible tensions and limitations to forming a collaboration. Any other questions? Oh, I have a.
A quick question. I'm wondering if if you considered sort of the role of the faith-based organizations versus non-faith-based organizations in these different cultures, especially since it's in the affordable housing field, and how that figured into these different cultures. And then another one, how do the directions, because some of these groups are funders, some of them are developers, some of them are, and I know you consider the type, but a lot of times there's sort of a direction of the relationship and how that works.
The biggest organization that sticks out the most is the most vocal, and the steering committee would classify as an individualist. We might have good reasons to think it'd be opposite, but that's how that was. In fact, there weren't any on the egalitarian side that are relevant to the fissure here. I don't know if that's.
So I think that some of the things is that within this field, some are, could be Christian, some are Jewish. I mean, I think you could think about different ways that they may see, depending on their religious preference. And
in your work, wouldn't it be correct to say that actually just because you're a faith-based organization does not place you in a particular organizational style, that there's a great variety of organizational styles within the faith-based community even?
Yeah, and sometimes those are far more important than what in other arenas like a house of worship, people in that organization say they believe. What they believe with religious hats on might not have a lot to do with what a faith-based organization does in the steering committee. So.
And then the question you said about, basically you're talking about the direction that the ties go in, is that paper where you talk about the bridging is looking at the same thing, like, do you share information? There's different networks. There's the sharing information, there's the sharing of resources. We have transactions going both ways. And so yes, it's going to make a difference in who and where you are in those things.
Make a difference in this?
This is an undirect, we've analyzed an undirected network because the data that we're doing here is answering the question, have you had a collaboration with this other organization? And our determination is that collaboration is like marriage. It involves two organizations. It's not, there are other network type of relationships that can be unidirectional, like status. Who do you think is important? Well, I may think Barack Obama is important, but I can guarantee you he doesn't think I am. But because this is collaboration, it just made more sense to have undirected ties.
But the way that organizations interact with each other is directional in these groups, right?
Anyway, so we would imagine that since these are mostly civic organizations, that what I was saying before is that if the two break, the person that's in between is, say, the government agency who's giving different resources to the service providers, you're right that the direction and where they are is going to make a difference.
But it didn't make it.
But here we're just talking about most of these people are collaborating as in terms of sharing information, being, trying to get their policy passed.
So here in the actual coding doesn't have to be reciprocal, is that what you're saying?
It doesn't have to be
Right.
reciprocated.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about the strength of ties as opposed to just the existence of ties and how that played into your research?
The
Yeah,
strength of ties.
that's
You mean like
multiplicity?
you mean like the
Casual conversation versus in-depth collaboration.
you mean like the intensity of the
Intensity,
tie?
yeah, as opposed to just being there. Because it's one thing to have a bunch of ties, but what's the quality of those ties?
So the quality of the ties are, I think that the qualities are pretty, I would say they were good to better to best. Yeah, so they have to nominate the person. So it's not just, these are not, like, I think that what Peter was asking now I think about the clustering, these are not affiliation networks. They've self-identified with the people who they share with. So these are strong, intense ties.
So how do you measure or differentiate which ones are stronger than others?
They all are in this case. What we could do is we have other data that we could say, and how many different capacities do they collaborate? Information resources, and we could, shared members was another one. So if you have one civic organization, another civic organization, advocacy organization, do you have an overlap of actual members would be another.
Did you not do that enough?
This wasn't enough? No, we have like another doing all this.
Yeah, so do you have 8 more hours? Here, we got more slides here.
Yeah.
So I guess we can talk after over lunch or whatever. Okay, great, thank you for
Thank
the
you.
presentation.